I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. You were just fabulous, every one of you, for your respectful and insightful examination of the judge's record. And I want to thank my Republican colleagues who chose to take this process seriously, no matter which side you voted on. The President sent us an impressive nominee. She merited a robust and thoughtful and lively examination. I thank the members who did it precisely that. In short, Madam President, this is one of the great moments of American history. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, in most states you had to be a white, male, Protestant landowner to be considered part of American society. So from the get-go, generations of Americans have sought to establish the United States as a full democracy. We fought a bloody civil war to end slavery. Women organized and reached for the ballot. The civil rights movement brought an end to the vicious segregation of the mid-20th century. And today, we are taking a giant, bold, and important step on the well-trodden path to fulfilling our country's founding promise. This is a great moment for Judge Jackson, but it is even a greater moment for America as we rise to a more perfect union. I thank my colleagues for their work, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District of Columbia to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is, and certainly appears to be, a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Yes. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. No. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King? Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis? Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall? Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran voted in the negative. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla? Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Paul, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President, very happily, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.